There's something here in Dakar, Senegal, and in 13 other African countries that most tourists don't notice. Something that connects this place to Paris over 4,000 kilometers away. A currency pegged to the euros and guaranteed by France. The CFA Franc. Using it, France controlled the monetary sovereignty of 14 countries, making up a population of approximately 210 million people. These countries include Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and the Republic of the Congo. And as these countries celebrate their independence each year, the truth is, their independence was only a shift from military occupation, but the conduct of business during the colonial times has remained the same. And if you are wondering why African countries are using a currency designed by their former colonizer decades after independence, well, that's the story I want to tell you today.
France continues to exploit poor African countries.
Questo è un bambino che lavora in una miniera d'oro in Burkina Faso.
Before we get into details, we must first set the basics by looking at what is the CFA franc and why it was created in the first place. You see, during the 1960s after World War II, many African nations started fighting for independence from their colonial rulers, and this revolution sent shockwaves through Europe as they were afraid of losing control of their main source of resources in the world. At the same time, France also signed the Bretton Woods Agreement, which required France to peg the French franc to the US dollar, eventually devaluing the franc and affecting its economy. So when France heard of the African Revolution, they said, "No way will we sit back and let all these resources go away," and came up with a new way of still getting resources and controlling their colonies, but not through military might, but through monetary and economic policies. On December 26, 1945, France issued a decree officially establishing the CFA franc, claiming the currency aimed to protect its African colonies from inflation caused by the devaluation of the French franc. In reality, this was a cover-up. The true purpose was to maintain economic control over its African colonies. The currency tied the economies of French Africa to France, enabling Paris to continue exploiting African resources and markets over and over again. The CFA franc was set to operate under a system where the West African franc and the Central African CFA franc are issued by two international banks which were situated in France, with France being a member and even having veto power, therefore can veto the economic decisions of these African states. Guinea, under President Ahmed Sékou was the only country to reject the offer and demanded that they were given complete independence from France. But France wasn't happy with the decision and decided to punish Guinea to serve as an example to the other African nations. They withdrew from the country quickly, taking everything they could with them. They even went as far as unscrewing light bulbs, burn medicines rather than leave them for the Guineans, stop paying the pensions of Guinean soldiers who fought for France, remove plans for sewage pipelines in Conakry, the capital, and did not support Guinea's accession to the United Nations. As if this wasn't enough, France flooded the country with counterfeit bills to induce hyperinflation and eventually collapse the Guinean economy, all the while funding anti-government resistance. Although the plan ultimately failed due to a number of leaks, Guinea's economy never really recovered. When Togo's leader, Sylvanus Olympio, opposed the CFA, this time they acted swiftly by assassinating him. It was clear to the other African nations that France wasn't to be messed with. After all the drama, further attempts made to conceal French imperialism in Africa was the splitting of the CFA franc into two currencies and Africanizing their respective banks, with one covering West Africa and the other covering Central Africa. At first, both currencies were issued internationally by their respective banks. By the 70s, the banks to both West African CFA and the Central African CFA were moved to Dakar, Senegal, and Yaoundé, Cameroon, respectively. Additionally, the CFA franc was pegged to the euros, with its value determined by the European Central Bank policies, requiring that African countries using the CFA franc must deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in the French treasury, which severely limited the financial independence of the member African states, as they have minimal control over their own money and often need to seek France's approval to access their reserves. Due to the CFA's fixed exchange rate with the euros, the CFA franc is overvalued, making exports from CFA franc countries less competitive on the global market, while imports from Europe become cheaper. As a result, local industries in these countries struggle to develop because of the cheaper goods from Europe, making it impossible to process raw materials at home and having no other choice than to export it at cheaper prices to Europe, which will then get processed there and sold back to these African states at higher prices, leading to high standards of living and unemployment. This imbalance ensures that African nations remain suppliers of cheap resources rather than becoming industrialized economies enough to be sovereign states. If we zoom out a bit, we will observe that the CFA franc system has long-term economic dependency rather than fostering growth. It has trapped many CFA countries into a cycle of exporting raw materials and importing finished goods from France and Europe, which in truth benefits only the former colonial powers while hindering African industrialization. Also, since the value of the CFA is tied to the euros, its value is dictated by European monetary policies, which we all can tell by the state of these African countries do not prioritize African economies, thus preventing African member countries from devaluing their own currency to boost export or adjust interest rates to stimulate economic growth. For example, during the 2008 global financial crisis, many independent nations adjusted their currencies to cushion the economic shock. However, CFA countries were forced to follow European monetary policies ill-suited to their needs, severely impacting their ability to mitigate the crisis effect. Despite being used for over 70 years, the CFA has largely failed to promote economic development in its member states. The reason: this system wasn't designed for African development. It was designed to benefit France and France alone.